Tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki a kātou. Kua tae mai ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. No mai, haere mai ki te Tai Ōhanga, the Treasury. Welcome very much to the Treasury to this very auspicious occasion. This is the final part of our Treasury guest lecture series over the year on the topic of fiscal policy for the future. And I'm Struan Little, who has the great honour of following on from Dominic Stevens in terms of marshalling this through for the year. Before we get into the substance of the day, just a couple of things for those of you who are physically here in terms of health and safety. All the normal things. If there's a fire alarm, there are Treasury staff here who will tell you where to go, but don't use the lifts. There's staircases over there and down that hall. Follow them. And earthquake, drop, cover and hold. I can assure you from personal experience that this building is extremely robust in such circumstances. If you need a bathroom, back over there to the kitchenette, just to the left of that, there's a door with toilets in there, and you won't need a security card to get back. Just a wee bit of context for the panel discussion today. This seminar rounds off a whole sequence of Treasury guest lecture series over the last year on the topic of fiscal policy for the future. We've had a whole lot of august speakers talk about the role of stabilising the sustainable and effective fiscal policies. And it's been a really wide range. What we're trying to get at is how we can design fiscal policy to support the government to meet its current and future obligations, and also to adapt to the changing circumstances and deliver value to the New Zealand public more generally. But we chose this topic deliberately this year because we knew this year we will be delivering three very important, what we call stewardship documents. The first being the long-term insights briefing early in the year, dealing with fiscal policy and shocks. The second one, the long-term fiscal statement, dealing with demographics and some of the long-run issues. And then most recently, the investment statement, dealing with the balance sheet as well. And this brings that whole program to a culmination because we're trying to bring together more of the fiscal policy debate. We had a seminar this morning on the investment statement, and somebody said to me, well, this is the time when the band stops playing. And I said, yes, this is the time when the band stops playing, but the music must go on, because fiscal policy doesn't go away. We've done all the hard mahi, and I think it's really important now that we continue the discussion as we go into the next year and beyond about the importance of some of the things that we've done this year. And so that's the context for me about what we're doing here. It's really about how we get a wider discourse in the public around the importance of fiscal policy in all its dimensions. And so just saying that, for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to look at these fine documents, a bit of a promo, they will be appearing on the Treasury website. And indeed, I think a link may magically appear as we are talking, should you need to do that as well. But what I really want to do today is we were sometimes accused in Treasury of talking to ourselves. And so I think the most important thing is actually to say, okay, this work we've done, how does it land out there? How does it land against some of the commentators, some of the thinkers in the New Zealand society? And so it's my real pleasure today, in terms of bringing this series to a conclusion, is to invite three distinguished guests to say, okay, what did you take out of some of our stewardship reports, and where should we go to next? And that's the purpose of today. And so I'd like to introduce my very distinguished panel, Zoe Wallis to my left, who is investment strategist at Forsyth Barr, but she's also been chief economist at Deloitte, at Kiwibank, in earlier roles in financial markets in the Reserve Bank and other places. And next door is Sarah Baddeley, partner in Martin Jenkins, part of the firm's leadership team, where she works on public sector reviews and organisational performance. But we know Sarah very well. She is a Treasury long-standing member, and before she went on in a wide range of public policy. And third, but far from least, Shamubeel Eaqub, who's chief economist and head of policy at Simplicity, well-known economic commentator and also previous roles, partner at Sense Partners, earlier roles, ANZ, Goldman Sachs, NZIA, and other places. So a really warm welcome to a panel. I think they bring very diverse perspectives, and that was quite deliberate. The logistics of how this is going to work. We have 3 questions for them. I'm seeing this as a relatively informal thing, so we'll see how it goes. But essentially, what I'll invite them to do is make some opening comments on each of 3 questions. But I'm really looking for a dialogue as well. And so as we go through, if there's things you want to say or comments you want to make, put your hand up. If you're online, and there are many of you online, and welcome, please put your questions in the chat. If there's a question you see there that you particularly like, feel free to put a thumbs up, so we'll make sure we answer that. And then there'll be plenty of scope, I think, to ask the panel questions and have a dialogue as we go through. And I think that's probably long enough an introduction. My notes say what I got out of these reports. I think that would probably be not the right thing to do, but I can't resist the opportunity. So if I took 3 things out of the suite of reports, what are they? And the first one is, I think they're all saying we've got some significant fiscal challenges as a country, and those are not just short-term challenges, they're longer-term challenges. The second, the consequence of that is, in resolving that issue, we're going to have to move on all fronts. That means expenditure, it means revenue, and it means the balance sheet. And then the third thing is, I think there's more focus now on the balance sheet because it has grown rapidly and has become bigger in both scale and complexity. And so for me, those are some of the things that I personally have taken out of that. However, having said that, with your permission, I think we should get on to the real substance of today. And so the first question, I'll start with you, for me, Zoe, just to give us some thoughts on what you saw as the most significant insights and trends in some of these stewardship reports, and how do you think they might actually shape some of the challenges we've got ahead?
Thank you. And thank you, first of all, Struan and the team, for inviting me to be here today. It's a real honour. Obviously, a hugely book, and it's fantastic to see these documents out in the public and getting an increasing amount of discussion as well and take up, I think, in terms of the media and the commentary associated with them. From my perspective, I think, really demographics is our destiny. That was a real clear standout for me, as we've known this, and it's kind of been sitting in the background for some time. But when you look at population growth rates, our aging demographics, what that means from a social and a healthcare perspective, we are clearly facing into some major headwinds that haven't really been tackled front on as yet. And it ultimately means what trade-offs are we as New Zealanders willing to face as we go forward. Now, I think, we can't fix the demographics issue. We can help moderate it perhaps to some extent through immigration, and that might be a theme that we pick up on later on. But, we've got a migration assumption in these projections of around 40,000 migrants per year, which was, compared to where we were a few years ago, relatively low. But in long term, if you look back 10 years ago, 40,000 was actually quite a high level of net immigration in New Zealand. So talking about meaningful immigration already coming in, that's nowhere near enough to offset the fiscal headwinds that we are facing. I thought one of the really key interesting things reading through the documents was actually that no one thing is going to solve this. You have to have a combination of policies if you really want to shift the dial on this. People are staying in work longer, and that's helpful, but people are also living longer in generally poorer levels of health. So even though longevity has increased for our population, what you're seeing is that actually people are just spending more of those years in not great health, which puts an increased burden on our healthcare and our social system. So that demographics piece is really the key take out of this, but also that we aren't going to solve this by increasing tax a little bit. We also have to think, as you've got that shifting workforce and labour force dynamics, and now you've got this huge, kind of disruptor event coming through from artificial intelligence. Actually, what does your revenue base look like? How much of that is going to rely on labour and PAYE, and how much of that may need to shift to a capital-based question? And that's obviously a bigger question mark. It wasn't necessarily tackled front on in these reports, but I think that is one that is circulating in the background of all the political debate and political commentary that is going on at the moment. Big question mark around how much government will want to tackle front on. These are obviously tough issues, and they're ones that don't have a political payoff in the near term for most parties, right? This is something that sets us up for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but you don't get elected on that. So how we match those two things up, I think, is going to be one of our biggest challenges as a nation. How do we ensure that future generations aren't left carrying the can in terms of our fiscal debt and fiscal balance sheet? So, you know, that was really the clear standout for me, as we are going to have to tackle this on multiple fronts, because there's no solving the demographics. So we have to do something on the policy front. And I might leave it there because I know these two have very good opinions that we'd like to get on to. But I can come back to expand
Thank you very much.
in future. Yeah.
Demographics is destiny and tackle on all fronts. Sarah, what would you like
We
to say?
should definitely come back to demographics and destiny, because I've got some reckons on the policy levers that are available when it comes to those levers. So congratulations, Treasury. Well done, team. I think that this suite of papers, you know, I left the firm, Treasury, probably near on 20 years ago now, and have been an avid reader of all of the stewardship documents in their various guises for years. And so what changed for me this time? Because sometimes I did actually really sit up and pay attention to this suite of stewardship documents. And I think my first observation is just the paradox that you really highlight in the suite. The fact that we have kind of, against a historic basis, outperformed, and yet the headwinds really are much stronger than we have had in the past. You know, we've had higher migration, we've had stronger workforce participation, we've had better terms of trade, and yet our debt position now means that we've got some real structural problems, not just a demographic challenge. So I think that's what leads you into the point you were making about a conversation about the balance sheet. That's one of the first insights that I really got from the work. The other thing that I got from the stewardship reports was a kind of a change in tone and urgency, and the fact that we've been, you know, running a structural operating deficit now for a couple of years, and even without future kind of aging pressures, funding and fiscal settings will need to adjust if we're going to make things more sustainable. So I think I really noticed that tone shift in the conversation from preparing for the future into fixing current imbalances while also preparing for the future. So that came through. And boy, that's not easy, and we'll get on to that kind of conversation as well. And then the third thing, probably with debt running as it is, it gets you into the old chestnut of productivity and that interplay between productivity and fiscal policy, and the degree to which, and this goes to Treasury's role, and I've been really heartened by some of your recent working papers as well, particularly the ones on human capital that I really enjoyed, around where government investment will really uplift from a productivity perspective. And so those are the kind of three themes. It was kind of despite the circumstances, because of the circumstances, and also that relationship and that interplay between productivity, policy enablement, fiscal settings, and I won't talk about the interplay between fiscal and monetary policy because other people are better equipped to talk to that. So those are the things that I talked. Lots of really interesting, challenging issues, and I think you've set the country up well to have those discussions.
Thanks very much. So, you know, there's a structural theme, a productivity theme, and I think probably worth coming back to a change. You're picking up a change in tone as well. Shamubeel.
Yeah, I guess I might start with a little bit of the wider context. I think in the public, the narrative has shifted to essentially there is no problem to one acceptance that there is a problem. So I think we are dealing with a public conversation and a mood that's probably quite different from it was from the last suite of reports. And I think what we're seeing, for example, with the conversation around capital gains tax, around KiwiSaver, those conversations have moved significantly from outright rejection to going, actually, there might be something to it, which I think is really important because you almost have to play to, you know, it takes a long time to earn the trust of the public to be able to have the conversation. And we're there now. What I really enjoyed about this work was actually a lot of the technical papers that came last year that was in the build up to this. For example, the work that your team had done around looking at essentially the fiscal spend and revenue across age groups. I think that work was really instrumental in setting all of this up. There was very good framing stuff, and we all had time to think about it. And essentially, my kind of back of the envelope with that piece of work was you need 5 working age people per retiree for our fiscal balance to work. If you have less than that, you're screwed. We currently have 4, and we're going to have 2 in 50 years' time. The work that you guys did on the OLG and the long-term stuff was really good because, again, it showed that those trade-offs, yes, but there are lost generations in between. Who is it going to be that's going to take that pain? So, we're not trying to hide in this melange of everybody has to bear a little bit of pain. Actually, that's not how it's going to play out. There will be some lost generations in this game because we've left it too late. I really like the investment statement. I know that's your favorite, Struan, but the reason I liked it is because of table 4.1. I'm a nerd. I love this kind of shit. It had the nice, I know it's not perfect, but what it had was essentially saying, if we actually had our OPEXs present valued in our balance sheet as well, which is quite often missed in our net worth, you would kind of really understand where our liabilities lie. A huge amount of our liabilities lie in the fact that our public service promises are so much bigger than our tax revenue settings. So therein lies the mismatch. I think it was $500 billion on the balance sheet. So yes, there was a whole bunch of stuff around the investment side, but I think that was a really helpful way for us to kind of have the conversation about our demographics, our current settings, and the future choices that are necessary to get us to that thing. And you didn't pretend that there were any unicorns, that there are some big choices to be made in all of this, which I thought was really, really useful. But the other thing that I found really useful, and I guess perhaps a gap, was in the investment statement, you talked about how we have good systems and processes to make good decisions, but we don't. We should maintain our assets, but we don't. We should have a better process for choosing new assets, new investments, but we don't. The reports don't answer the question of why that is. And of course, it's partly to do with institutional capability, it's partly to do with the public appetite, it's partly to do with the politics. But fundamentally, in my view, is there is a short-termism that's crept into the wider perspective. And what you're trying to do with the stewardship work is essentially going, actually, we need to shift our mindset from short-termism to stewardship. And how do we do it? Who does it? And when does it happen? Those are the big questions that these reports pose for me. It's less about the technical solutions. I think we do have a lot of smart people who can come up with the right technical solutions. But there is a wider perspective of long-termism, stewardship, willing to bear cost for other people that is currently missing. That part is probably the biggest glaring gap in the wider narrative of the long-term documents.
So the next question is going to be on gaps. So I'll come back to that, but and just a warning, I'll summarize what you did, but if any of the panel want to comment on anybody else's, I think that might be a useful thing at the moment. But what I got out of your some of your comments was just appreciation of some of our technical work in the background. That's
and the fact that you published it on GitHub, that was really good. I really like that because I'm a nerd, love that stuff.
And a shout out to our work on comprehensive net worth, which I'm particularly proud of. But also some of the points you made, I think, about that point about a lost generation in terms of the transition, and also just that that the public dialogue is shifting as well. But is there anything anybody just sparked?
Yeah, so I think I agree with the comments around the Crown's ability as an asset steward and asset management. I thought that the way that was exposed in terms of the quality of asset management practice, the quality of information available, the degree to which the Crown's core assets have actually been sweated in terms of some of the metrics that were provided in the report. I kind of knew it. And I think that is a big opportunity. I think there is a significant room for the Crown to improve its asset management practices and its discipline around the management of its assets. So I think, I agree with you there. I thought that the report was kind of largely procedural. As someone who has been both guardian of the purse and bidder to the purse, I do think that that some of the practices around the kind of marginal capex investment decisions, there's still plenty of room for improvement there. And when we've got good information now, obviously the work the Infrastructure Commission have been doing about the quality of the Crown's infrastructure asset management is kind of well understood as well. So that's in terms of gaps and then therefore exciting opportunities that, I probably agree with you on that. I think that's a good thing to take forward out of the work.
I guess the point I was trying to make though, Sarah, was there is a parallel to how we're making those decisions in policy making and in our OPEX as well. There is a wider issue in my mind that the investment report highlighted, which was not mentioned in the other reports, which is the institutional capability for us to be able to coordinating and cohesive force.
I agree.
That
Yeah.
I think it came through very strongly.
Yeah, agree.
So have you got any reflections you'd like to throw in at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're sort of verging towards the capital asset recycling conversation, right? I think that chart in the investment statement was very stark around, what the return on listed versus unlisted Crown assets is and how that looks. I guess there's a more philosophical question about how many of those assets we actually want to hold on to as a nation. And I think that's not actually a financial question, although I completely agree there's absolutely room for improvement in terms of what we do hold on to. But it almost verges into a philosophical debate. Do we want to have a national bank? I'm ex-Kiwi Bank, and it was always a weird quasi-state-owned enterprise, but trying to operate like a real bank. And it kind of got trapped, neither winning on both sides in my mind because of that. That's obviously a clear question mark is, do we want to have a national bank? Do we want to have a national post service? And those aren't necessarily, you could basically say, well, we'll hold on to those from an institutional perspective because we believe it's right for the country to have its own versions of those asset providers and just run it at a cost of equity. That might be fine, rather than actually this needs to be a commercial return to the Crown, in which this electricity generators, for example, have done very well. So I think that isn't necessarily a pure monetary decision. It's actually a philosophical question that we as a country need to decide, and having a referendum on that may well be the way we go.
It's a really tricky time globally to be having that kind of policy discussion around your policy objectives for holding different assets, the Crown holding different assets in different types. If you think about the maturity of our own ability to have that conversation and the global trend toward economic nationalism and geopolitical uncertainty changing. I know certainly I would have a different view now than I did 15, 20 years ago about how much you might weight those policy objectives. So I think that the reports sort of set us up for a good conversation, but they are very much focused on the financial aspects. And I agree with you, it's a much more nuanced conversation. Whether we're going to be capable to have that conversation, I think, is the existential issue.
Let me jump in and just, because you've said some really nice things, I think, so far about the work we've done. I thank you and applaud you for that. But Shamubeel started to touch on some of the gaps about some of the things you may have expected to see in those documents and didn't, or some of the things that may have made it stronger. And I think that's worth reflecting on as well. I might start with you, Sarah, if I can this time.
Yeah, well, I did obviously learn my critical thinking trade here. So it's kind of not that it was missing, it's more and it goes a little bit to what next. Distributional impacts, obviously. It was the big missing piece. I think probably most of the most interesting work that I've been doing has been the within particular cohort effects, and that's where the real policy work is. Give the example, we contributed recently to Jane Wrightson's retirement savings work. We did a life course analysis of the impact on retirement of the retirement system of women. And that's when you actually start to get into some of the really significant distributional issues that make you think about some of the big fiscal choices and trade-offs you're making in a different way. So, you can't do everything in a concise, well-written, excellent pitches document, but that would be the kind of area where I think some of our national discussion around some of the big rocks that you have been trying to lift in the papers will get weighted down. You set it up nicely, but that's where I'd like it to go next. I think I've mentioned that issue about the relationship between productivity and fiscal settings. So actually some investments are better than others in absolute terms, and yet we are universally, to your point, not very good at articulating, measuring and holding people to account for the delivery of those productivity benefits. And so not all investments are equal, both OPEX and CAPEX. And I really did enjoy the chart of when, the resilience piece and the way that different policy interventions should be brought to bear in particular circumstances. I think that was excellent, because the other gap that you talk around the edges of is our ability to turn things off when they have either stopped their relevance or past their use by date. So those are some of the things. There's a big question here around political economy, which is one for the people over the road. For me, it's more around policy implementation, and maybe we can get to that. Have we got the collective horsepower to deliver the kinds of changes that might be required?
I'm going to Zoe next, but actually I wouldn't mind you picking up that point as well when you talk about your gaps as well, because I think Shamubeel, you're onto that. But what gaps are you seeing, Zoe?
Yeah, look, I mean, I found looking back through history about how these have changed through, how the forecasts have changed through time, and Sarah alluded to that earlier, is actually, we got saved by a bit more of a growth boost and a bit more immigration coming through. Actually, GDP was stronger than we expected. I guess with everything, these are subject to very prescriptive assumptions, right? So one thing I would have liked to see was a bit more of a kind of scenario analysis. Okay, if, actually you said, well, actually interest rates are going to be structurally higher over the next 10 years, what does that look like? Or if actually we could grow that little bit more, or lift our productivity that little bit more, or that ends up being worse than we expect and we don't quite get back to that 1% that's assumed, I think, in the docs. How does that change the fan charts essentially over time? Yeah, I think that sort of the scenario planning piece would be quite an interesting one. I think ultimately looking at the solutions base, you provided some sort of tidbits or insights into actually where we could go. So, I think one was raising income tax, one was raising GST. But I think, the other piece that needs to tie into this is actually that conversation around wealth tax, capital tax, and time, and, the current work that's done. So overlaying that piece as well, because I think it's increasingly going to be part of the solution. Just be personal view.
So a couple of things coming in there. I mean, there's the point about, I think, distributional that Sarah made, and then there's definitely a point about scenarios and sensitivities that I think you're making. And then I think there's a conversation, I'm setting you up here, Shamubeel, but there's something about how far you go on the policy side, the political economy, but also the capability in terms of the public sector. So there's things we can do. But gaps, Shamubeel.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this before, and fundamentally, I think the big gap for me was really around that. What's our theory of change? I think we have defined the problem. We've said that there's some big levers that we need to pursue, but what is our theory of change in terms of how this happens? It doesn't happen with Mandarin sitting here designing policies that are perfect, that are implemented, because actually it's about the public buying that stuff and the politicians being able to hold that and implement it. So I think there is an element of that what does it look like, and what is the role of Treasury and others in that space? So if I think about the Treasury's role, I think there is a little bit of a reimagination of what Treasury does into the future. That gap, I think, is one that we're a little bit more self-reflection of what can we do differently to contribute to this change, I think would be useful. And the way I think about it is Treasury is probably the most well-placed to provide that orchestrating role in government. I don't think it has done a very good job of it, as you've identified in your investment statement, for example, that we have systems and processes, but they're not being implemented. Why not? What are we going to do about it to improve that? How can we have that accountability and transparency? At the moment, we have transparency, but not accountability. So my sense is that the role of Treasury going forward becomes quite important. We're not outside of the system, we're in the system. We can change things within that. And a lot of that is to do with what role do we play in terms of that coordination and cohesion function across government, because that came through very strongly, that siloed approach to government, where we are quite often working in different directions. As a result, the net effect is not quite right. So that's probably where the big gap, but I think there is also a much harder, bigger piece around how do we kind of have that engagement with the public and the political economy that Sarah mentioned, because those two things, that's where the rubber hit the road. I guess I'm probably a little bit less pessimistic than Zoe on this one, which is unusual for me. But the reason for that is, like I mentioned, when I'm going around the country talking about demographics, it's people like, we know. The conversation we're having capital gains tax, the conversations we're having about KiwiSaver at the moment, they're way more mature than I have seen in the last 10 years. So I feel like we're in a really good position where the public is willing. And there is a little gap in terms of how do we use this moment in time to really give people access to those big choices that are necessary. And the fact that some of us will have to make some sacrifices so that our grandchildren have a better future.
So actually, I might go back to you, Zoe, because you started at that point saying you read the documents and you sort of some tidbits of policy. And so do you want to respond to some of the thoughts there?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a fair point, and I'm really sort of, there's a huge amount of optimism behind that sentiment. You know,
She's a
and
cynical
I'm
optimist,
like
like
us all, but I'm also slightly cynical. And that, you know, when it comes to people actually, and this is human behavior fundamentally, when it comes to people putting their money where their mouth is, people often still act, unfortunately, in a very self-interested manner. We're not even very good at planning for our future selves, let alone our future grandkids, right? So I'm hopeful, but I'm also a bit of a realist when it comes to that. Is, you know,
I guess, you know, when I was looking through the numbers, what I saw was within the next 20 years, we're going to have a political economy that will force us to have this decision. So pretty much 100% of our PAYE taxes will be spent on super and health within the next 20 years. There's no way the workers are going to say, it's okay, old people, you promised yourself all these nice things and you never made any plans and you can have it. It's not going to happen. You know, they're going to say bugger off. And so we want to preempt that and make it a little bit smoother.
Yeah, and absolutely. And
I think that's what Struan's trying to get to is, can we smooth that path a little bit rather than doing that massive step shift in one place.
Very clear in the work as well, right? As you make the choices now to have a better future long term and take less pain overall. Exactly.
I'll come to you, but I would just want to ask Zoe another question, and I'll get your view on this as well. But how far do you think we should go? Because, you know, it was you pointed out we were carefully calibrated in terms of how far we went on policy. Do you think we got that about right? Should we have gone further? Are we exceeding our mandate?
No, I think you're doing a good job for the people of New Zealand in terms of raising these questions and they're having that debate. Could you have gone further? Perhaps, but I feel like it's not that, you know, it's not like you're finished now, right? This is an incremental step. So I think as, you know, perhaps the social mandate gets bigger, you can push that further as you go through time as well. So I think, you know, you've opened the door. That's the right approach. But if I might add one more question, I think if you look back 30 or 40 years and you think about the role government played in terms of becoming a counter-cyclical agency, that's changed a huge amount. You know, being the sort of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, like you know, you look at the COVID response and the amount of money that got spent during that period, and that's, okay, one government decision, but that's generally been true post GFC as well. When you look across, you know, the last 20 years, increasing fiscal spending to mop up economic crises and financial crises. Now, I think both New Zealand and globally actually face a bit more of a question mark about how much of that they can afford to do going forward. And, you know, I know that there was sort of an assumption, there wasn't an implicit assumption that we will have those again, but there was definitely, in the forecasts, I believe, but there was definitely, you know, the commentary around that it is highly likely. You know, you get one of these events every 10 years, and that will put more fiscal pressure on us. So maybe that's also part of the debate is what role does government play in terms of trying to absorb and trying to act as that counter-cyclical force.
Yeah, and I thought Dominic's paper, where before he left, the first paper that you guys did on this, which is really around responding to shocks, was helpful because it was all about being transparent and having those tools ready ahead of time. So you have a toolkit that's available. We can still have those conversations about are those tools right and all those kinds of things. But I think to your point, you know, the same applies in terms of the policy work. I don't think these documents were the right places to have the policy solutions in there. But you need to have them ready in your back pocket. So when a willing government is in power, you should be able to produce that evidence quickly so that we're able to take advantage of our political terms. Because I think those mandates are not going to be necessarily available for long windows. So we want to use them as and when we can.
Sarah, I mean, just to be interested in your observations. Again, there's two parts to this: the social mandate, I guess, into how far we go, but also some of the implementation points that you're raising as well. Treasury's role.
Yeah. So on the first point, I think I kind of in my mind, my analytical framework, I've got social consensus and then there's political consensus, and your stewardship role serves both. But if you look at what's happening across developed countries and the work that's been done by organisations like the OECD, you can see that the kind of increasing distrust, or, you know, in some extremes, the crisis of confidence that developed economies are having in relation to the demographic pressures they're facing and the policy choices that then flow from that is, you know, something we can learn from, because we are in a slightly better shape than them, you know. So the French government and retirement savings is the one that's obviously got nerds like me biting their nails. And I think that Treasury plays an incredibly important role in that social consensus. in terms of making sure that those discussions and that awareness is well informed, and the quality of your communication and materials, the simplicity of really complex materials. Political consensus, I think, really comes at the next layer down, which is in those big policy choices. And that goes to what I call the policy muscle, to deliver good quality advice to the people that should rightly make these decisions. And there are some mechanisms of policy choice that I think we're going to have to be really match fit on. Obviously, when it comes to trade-off and distributional effects, you know, we're going to have to, across different policy areas, reconfront means testing. You know, we're going to have to recalibrate what wealth is, how wealth is held, what income is, and where income is held and generated. And so we're going to have to be really good at thinking about that. We're going to have to be, as I said earlier, really much better at asset management, because the assets have been sweated. So if we choose, or if the politicians choose to keep them, we need to manage them well. If they're commercial, we need to drive performance hard. And if they are non-commercial, we need to be clear around our policy objectives and whether they're best met by ownership or regulation or some other means. So I always look at asset management in its broadest of senses. I think we also need to be, in policy terms, we need to have more muscle in partnering. I think, you know, this government in particular, but they're not the first time, have been, you know, have quite high expectations around the role of private finance. We now have a credible budget constraint that we perhaps haven't in the past. The whole Crown's cost of capital is lower than anyone else's, so we should pay for it rhetoric that I was well schooled in wasn't sophisticated when it came to where should risk be managed. And we need to be better at partnering. We need to be better at risk identification, and we need to be better at risk sharing and more sophisticated. I spent my time in the commercial team at Treasury. The Crown is a, appalling negotiator and an appalling business partner. And we're going to need to be better at that as a country if we're going to address some of the infrastructure gaps we have. So those are kind of, I kind of see, look at our social consensus in the global context. Like, all big developed economies have got this demographic pressure and these hard trade-offs, and then really think Treasury's role is to drive the policy and system muscle that will inform good quality decisions.
I'll keep us going, because I just want to make sure there's an opportunity to open it up to the audience. But I do think it's worth touching on my third question, and I might start with Shamubeel this time too. Just standing back, because we've produced these three big reports and this whole work program. I think the themes have to continue and will continue. But there's already, I think we should be thinking where to next and what's the frontier. And so the other question for the panel is, any thoughts they got about where we should be pushing if we were doing these again, or the next lot, which is coming up perilously soon, because we do one every 4 years, and the work for that takes a couple of years before then. But any thoughts there, Shamubeel?
Yeah.
Oh, and think up your questions, by the way, and then we...
Yeah, the first one is, I guess, this year it felt like the long-term reports were more coordinated across many of the big agencies. So the report from IRD, I thought, was very good. I think the work from MB was quite helpful in kind of taking the big systems view, your work, plus some of the work from MSD. So there was a good cross-section of coordinated approach, which I thought was really useful, where government was speaking with one voice, or the public service was speaking with one voice. I think that's helpful. The next step from here, I think the evidence is pretty clear in terms of that closing window of us making these choices. And I think over the course of the next 4 years, we have to prioritize immediate choices that we can make that are going to set us up for the future. So I think you have to prioritize those choices that are there. And the Treasury, I think, is going to play a really important role in looking at that across the system, across the public system, what it can do. So to my earlier point, I think it's really about Treasury taking back its mantle as that stewardship, orchestrating role in the public service that's able to hold that long-term picture and provide that coordination, cohesion across the public service. Because I think the coordination aspect will give us a lot of headroom in the next little while. I think that's the first cab off the rank. It's the bits where we're bumping against each other that's currently causing, I think, a lot of the distributional problems. And as a result, the excess spend, wasteful spend, all those other bits and pieces. But there is also an element of how can the public service engage with the public more? Because I think what you have shown this year is that when you produce work that is coordinated, digestible, well communicated, you can affect the public conversation. That is really important. And you've got lots of partners in the room. Engaging with all of them to do that, I think, is going to be one of those big things for the next 4 years, not just in year 4, but between here and then.
Sarah.
I've got a to-do list here. I'm not sure who's taking notes on the Treasury priorities for next year. So I've got enhanced distributional modelling. So, you know, in a fiscally constrained future, you're going to have to prioritise ruthlessly, and you're going to have incredibly sophisticated information. So income, wealth, age, ethnicity, and location. I think, you know, just reflecting on the government's announcements yesterday about the Crown's relationship with local government as major asset stewards, as well as it goes to location, and certainly some labour market work I've done in the past in Auckland really highlights that, you know, the good children of the North Shore can swamp some of the challenges in other parts of Auckland when it comes to actually kind of looking at sub-regional analysis. I had more dynamic scenario analysis, so tick from Zoe, and also just productivity, innovation, deep dive. You know, are we actually going to have to, and you touched on it actually, Struan, in your speech on tax recently around the tax system and the role tax system can play in terms of how we think about where we incentivise people to invest and what return that they have. The other thing that we haven't really touched on so much, but it goes to Dominic's earlier paper, which I also agree was very good, around shocks. You know, we need to be really good at shocks, shockingly good at shocks, actually. And we've got a good history. We just need to get back on track sooner, and that's the pattern. And so approaching those exogenous shocks with a good economic resilience mindset, I think, would be really beneficial. So those were the things on my to-do list, which I thought was pretty modest, actually, Struan. So I look forward to the team getting onto it.
Yeah, no, that'll be next year. Have you thought about the year after that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Look, this is probably more a bit of a question mark for me, but, you know, you think about long-term planning in New Zealand, and infrastructure is a prime example, right? Is we flip-flop. Every 3 years we flip-flop. So we know the trend and we know the general direction that we need to head in. It's almost is there a way of it, like, building into the system some sort of longevity, you know, long planning that actually avoids that flip-flopping between political cycles, right? Because that ends up being very costly in terms of, decision-making, changes in policy, changes in path, changes in preferred mechanism, you know, bike lanes here versus there versus none. The prime example in Wellington at the moment, you know, actually long term, how do you make a decision? How do you get successive governments to then stick with it? Capital gains on property being a prime example, right? It's in, it's out. And that changes your tax structure going forward. So I don't know, and this is probably a bigger question mark, but is there something similar to, you know, infrastructure where you can actually have a 30-year plan and get commitment, bipartisan commitment, to stick to it, to actually deliver on the financial goals? And it might be too big for your remit, but I don't know. That's a bigger question mark for me, right? Is how you get everyone to agree on this point in time today. There seems to be political willpower, but how do you lock that in for the next 5, 10, 30 years?
Yeah, the question really is around what are the commitment mechanisms in a democracy with a 3-year political term. Yeah. So those are not necessarily easy things to resolve. And I guess that was my wider question around how do we kind of get a long-termism in the decision making on some things. And I think the way we do it is what they're trying to do is through the science, to say we don't have choices. We have to do some of these things, and it becomes the norm, right? But do we have enough time to do it in that way, or are there other ways to accelerate? And I think the acceleration in my mind is, at least here, is what is the role that Treasury plays in saying, no, you don't have those choices, and being really explicit and being that fearless advisor to government. And the information is open to the public that in spite of good advice, we're making bad choices.
So just briefly summarize that and then start to open up the floor. But there's some thoughts in here about, you know, the next frontier is something about more scenario stuff, more distribution, because that's going to be incredibly important. I think Shamubeel's point is something I haven't thought enough about, you know, I think we've done a good job as a Treasury of being coordinated. He's saying, yeah, but how you coordinated right across the public sector, and how do we? And I think that goes to your point, Zoe, that I think we'll be exceeding our mandate, but more about what can we help some of those credible commitment mechanisms, because as a leader in the civil service, I think we play an important role in at least part of that. And so it's thinking about what we can do in that institutional design side to support some of these conversations.
It could be around how we design, the policy implementation, the contracts that we write, the KPIs that we create. These are all quite administrative, institutional muscle things. But there are things that we can do in the way that we design and implement policies that can create some of the longevity. And the longevity, I think, is what we're talking about, is to give us that little bit more room. So I don't mind political bickering about infrastructure projects, but I want the bickering to be about the project in year 7, not in year 1.
I think also I would hate for Treasury to be thinking about its role within the public service system only. Some of the biggest rocks that are identified in these reports are, within quite complex systems, and government only holds some of the levers. So is the relationship between, capital intensity, investment and productivity, the relationship between care responsibilities, retirement savings and workforce participation, those kinds of system-based cross-cutting, cross-portfolio issues are the ones that will require partnership across government. Sure, central agencies are best placed to do that, but probably also across the economy. So that's what I'd really emphasise as well.
And I think, Sarah, you're absolutely right. So I think we too often think about government only in that doing, legislating, spending side of things. There's lots of other roles that government play, and we have to lean into those because we don't have time. So we have to pull every lever that's possible. One of the things that government can do that nobody else can do is convening power, being able to bring different disparate groups together, to be able to share information, to be able to co-design with people. There's a whole bunch of things we can do. There's a whole matrix of opportunities of what government can do. I think at the moment we lean too far on the hard edge of government and not enough on the soft edge of government, which is also really important in that partnership space.
Yeah, government can also stay out, which is sometimes the best thing that government can do. But a great example of where the government can play a really critical role in a private sector response is the recommendations Jane Wrightson had in the retirement savings reports. Credit to Patrick Nolan as well, former alumni, around information. The quality of information around KiwiSaver in particular being more available to providers to enable them to become more sophisticated. So that's an example where the role of government is actually quite limited, but could be quite powerful in enabling the private sector to better participate.
I've got some questions on the screen that I'll come to, but if anybody's got questions here, I might start with you, Lynn, before I go to well, actually, no, I'll do one off the screen because I think it's kind of interesting. The first one I've got really is around natural hazards and rising costs, and how do we get more proactive around that and build that into some of our fiscal and economic thinking? So you don't all have to respond to this, but anyway, I think that's
I was doing a bunch of talks after the cyclone Gabrielle in Tairāwhiti, and my kind of message to them was New Zealand probably has 2 more big disasters before we stop bailing you out. And that's when I think we're going to start preparing, because New Zealand is very good at responding to crises, but not good enough at learning. And then, I think the work that Dominic did was very much trying to say, let us try and learn from what we have done so far, because we are running out of the headroom. And what I took away from all of this stuff was, it's fine to use your balance sheet to respond to this crisis when they come, but you have to have a mechanism to pay it back when times are better. And we haven't done that, but political economy has been there. This is where the transparency is going to be really, really critical. But I think we also need to work very closely with the insurance sector to kind of do this. We are a highly insured country. They are ready to partner, ready to kind of do more, but they can't do it on their own. They are not the right people to lead it.
Yeah, there's probably a bigger question as well, though, right? Like, if you think about the events that have happened in New Zealand and the cost of insurance to your average person, right? There is a growing share of the market who are now uninsured because it's too expensive, right? So I'm not sure we can. I don't know if we can rely on the insurance sector.
I don't think we can.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you have to, at a really time where you're fiscally constrained, think about how you grow a stopgap for that in terms of a public fund, or, I guess we've got EQC already, but.
Yeah,
Let me jump around. I'll come back to some things. I'll make sure we do a few questions and I'll try and bring it back. But Lynn, you had a question.
Demographic Centre within the Treasury. If you look at the long-term insights briefings, apart from the Treasury and housing, there were very few departments that actually made significant use of our current demographic knowledge. The key agencies that have done are, funnily enough, the Infrastructure Commission and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. And it seems to me that there's a real gap there and a wonderful space for the Treasury. I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago, but I think the Treasury is really going to have to be the central leader in how we think about demographic issues. There are issues like immigration. Well, migrants age, and they also can bring in older dependents. So we can't see immigration as the simple solution to an aging population mix. Secondly, we've got two wonderfully demographic dynamic subpopulations, Maori and Pacific. Their age distribution is the same as it was when you were a young lad in the 70s and the post-war baby boom was striking the European population. We need to invest seriously in Pacific and Maori populations because of that demographic dynamism. We're not seeing that. We're worrying so much about old folks like me and not enough about the other balancing policies. So just a couple of cheeky comments, but I would like to see, if you set up the Treasury Centre, I'll come along to the opening.
Can I just say though, in the report, there was a very specific comment on investing in young people as one of the key strategies. So I think that was one part of the long-term briefing I thought was really useful, but we're not doing enough of that. So, you kind of put it up in that context.
Yeah.
But just to say, you are also absolutely right on the immigration thing. It is not a free hit, right? Especially because in the social cohesion survey, we found that only 50% of New Zealanders think that immigrants make good citizens. The comparable number in Australia is 90% of Australians think immigrants make good citizens. I don't think New Zealand has unlimited social license for immigration to deal with our demographic challenges, even to buy us time.
Part of the issue though, right, is that we haven't planned for immigration in a cohesive way, right? Like we turn the tap on and off haphazardly depending on what we've got in terms of labour shortages. When our borders are closed, labour shortage, turn it back on. We don't have a plan for what that looks like, who we're trying to invest over the long term.
Short-termism again.
Short-termism, exactly. And that creates problems, right? Because then you have infrastructure issues, you have housing issues, you have
all of those.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And you haven't planned for that growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember. It was probably Dave Murray that did the work. He's very good on this topic. But our capacity to actually influence the composition of our migrants is so much a push and pull factor. So even when we have had policy settings in place, it's been kind of counter-cyclical because everyone's chasing those people. And if you look at our kind of global trends in terms of demographic patterns, it was a point you made earlier. Everyone's going to be in the market for highly educated, highly mobile migrants. I would, though, just like to support the comment around what the Treasury working papers say about who we should be investing on. The Treasury and their working papers, complementary to these stewardship reports, very much say that there is a real demographic shape to the age and stage and ethnicity of who we should be investing in. And I completely agree that Māori and Pacific success, I do a presentation, who's going to play for my super, and it starts with a photograph of a young woman who's quintessentially South Auckland. Is she Māori? Is she Pacific? She's probably both. And really, she needs to be at the top of her game to pay for my comfortable retirement. And it shouldn't really be the expectation I have of her, but that's what the data is saying that it will be.
I'm going to throw the next question back to you, Sarah. Off the screen, and builds on one of your previous comments. You said, Sarah mentioned the Crown's an appalling negotiator, an appalling partner. Keen for you to elaborate more on this. Why is this a trend? But so that's the narrow question. But there's also another question which is broader, and I think so. Let's start off with you, but for the panel, what tools do you think are needed to make better choices about the delivery of public goods and the supporting asset base that don't exist now or that we don't use them? So that's a bit of the discussion you're all having first. So yeah. Sarah, start off.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the buy and the sell side of Crown negotiations. And the Crown is an appalling negotiator because it can't walk away. Inevitably the transaction will be either a bailout or a form of crisis in which the Crown is stepping up with policy objectives around saving an asset, or alternatively the political commitment is so high and the public commitment is so high that unlike other commercial transactions, there is an inability to walk away. So that's kind of the primary kind of negotiating floor. And then secondary, the Crown is not a skilled negotiator. You know, deal makers be deal makers, and it is a capability and a skill set. And when there have been transactions in the past, often we've been able to dial up capability and work in partnership with advisors, and that's been kind of totally executed. But that interface in particular between making sure that ministers will hold the line and get good terms on behalf of the taxpayers is not one that you can typically import or helicopter talent into easily. And finally, the Crown has very deep pockets, even though they're not as deep as they were. They're still relatively deep compared to other pockets, and there's certainly more capacity to open them based on, irrational data. So, when you're involved in a commercial negotiation with the Crown, there's usually at least 4 counterparties. There's the Treasury, there's the Minister, there's the person that's advising the Minister. It is not a straightforward commercial negotiation. So I'm drawing on my direct experience on both sides of the deal that the Crown is an appalling negotiator. And, as it would be, as it is all the world over. It's not a criticism of the New Zealand government or the, officials. It's just the way it is. It's incentive structure stuff. So that's what I mean.
And any comments, maybe from the others, about the more generic, because we had a discussion before about just that point about the asset management. That's one of the themes that comes through the investment. What is it that we could do more or should do more, do you think?
Can I suggest that when it comes to the commercial holdings, at least a Temasek style fund can give you an opportunity to kind of remove some of that politics, because its objectives are much longer term, doesn't have the day-to-day political interference. I kind of did a little doodle next to the investments where you had the balance sheet broken down, the commercial stuff. It would sit much more nicely under something like that doesn't have the same level of political uncertainty. But I think it's really around that capability building. So it's never going to be perfect, but it's about investing in that capacity building inside of our public institutions. The way I think about it is we have the systems, but we're not implementing them. We should be able to fix that. Because is it because you don't have the authorizing environment, or is it something else? But surely it is something that we can fix now that you've identified the problem.
Mm.
So I'm probably a little bit optimistic that it's solvable, at least in terms of improvement, if not entirely doing away with it, because I think that would be unrealistic.
Or design for it.
Yeah.
Design for it. And yeah, you're right. That as a structured guardians of the super is obviously the clear way that we've done that in the past. Treasury's stewardship role in pushing back on the very natural tendency for ministers to reach into investment decisions that ought be best distanced from them is another role that Treasury can play. Protect them from
my chief optimist on the left here.
Look, I think when you look at that, the portfolio of assets, the biggest place you can move the dial is on the social side, right? You think hospitals, schools, the physical property assets we have. When you look at commercial assets, about 17%, the financial assets, smaller percentage again, but sort of probably not much you can do to tinker with those, or you would want to do. It's the social assets, and it's how you get the right investment decisions being made. How do you get efficiencies? I remember I was involved in some of the Three Waters discussions and just talking to suppliers and contractors around, having a clear long-term pipeline of what the projects were, how much to spend, what was the size of the prize, would have a huge impact on, driving the right skill sets in terms of the industry, driving the right outcomes, driving the right business models, and then government can go and negotiate from there. So I think using that balance sheet or those asset base as a really strong lever to be more competitive to some extent, where you've got this pipeline, but got to have a clear plan about what you're doing with it over the next 20 years to provide that certainty to people on the other side.
But it doesn't come with a ribbon cutting.
Long before that.
Just checking other questions from here from the floor here. I've got a couple more here. Well, maybe a good question. How do you feel? What do you think about New Zealand state's capacity? Do you come away thinking the bottleneck is a state capacity issue, or is it political will, or is it underlying voter preferences?
All of the above. I don't think you can abstract from that. I think society is fractured, which is reflected in our politics, and arguably our institutional capacity has been eroded over time. Mainly because we've been tasked with specific things. In your reports, you had Tai Ōhanga that was highlighted as one particular organization that has done a really bad job of maintaining its assets, but it didn't happen by accident. We took away its resources and its mandate to maintain those assets. So these are not, these are not things. So I don't think we can kind of disentangle all those things. There is a whole bunch of issues that are working all at the same time.
I'm probably, I'll strike out as the optimist on this one. What we're experiencing is directly correlated with what other countries are experiencing in terms of increasing distrust, increasing fiscal pressure, productivity pressure. And so, we're on brand. And I still, when you're talking about natural disasters, we're excellent at natural disasters in terms of our systems and our preparedness and our level of insurance compared to others might be. Good that we are, we're not Chile, but we're basically Chile. We're still small. We can still be nimble. We've got good quality information. We've got things like the stewardship reports. We've got Treasury playing its role. I think that some of this is about getting our mojo back and actually seeing some of these challenges that we have ahead as, gigantic, big opportunities to really think innovatively and once again kind of charge forward in terms of innovative public service changes and innovative reform and supporting the community to understand why and politicians to make well-informed decisions.
Look, I very much agree with Sarah, and I think there's probably lessons we can learn from global experience, right? If you look at countries like Japan, 20, 30 years ahead of us in terms of their demographic headwinds. You look at, resources just sitting empty, schools being abandoned because they just don't actually have the children in some of those regions coming through. Yes, we can debate demographics and how we fix it, and I think that's an important component of it, but actually can we future-proof ourselves that if we don't need that school in 20 or 30 years' time, it might become a rest home or it might become an alternative use, right? So thinking more strategically based on other people's lessons, taking some of that.
There's an elephant in the room here. Somebody's got a question about essentially New Zealand super, saying, hey, there's a bunch of economists out there, on different sides, Andrew Coleman talking about pre-funding, Robert McCulloch talking about the need for private mechanisms. Where do you think we need to go on that?
Yeah. Yeah.
We should just copy Australia. I mean, essentially, that's the only option that's in front of us now. We've kind of squandered too much time. There's not much else we can do. So I think, actually, that was one of the things I disliked about the report, where it said Australia's incentive system for superannuation is very expensive. It's not. Their retirement system is way more sustainable than ours. So it can't be more expensive than ours, right? So when I look at the options that are available to us, I think it's very limited. We have KiwiSaver, we have super. KiwiSaver has to be bigger, super has to be smaller. And the question is, who pays the price in the middle? Which generation loses out? Somebody's got to be in the middle of the ship sandwich.
I think that we need to put more policy effort and political discussion into the transition rather than the choice. We make it kind of binary, means tested or not. KiwiSaver higher, compulsory or not. Whereas actually the true transition, and it should be a long transition, is where the real policy creativity comes in. It's around, what kind of time frame, what kind of phasing, what kind of mechanisms, how put more policy effort into thinking about safeguarding than you do into thinking about some of the other big choices, and that will make some of the big issues more politically palatable cross-party for longer periods. So that's where I'd put the policy effort in, less thinking about the choice and more thinking about the transition.
I think on that point, climate transition literature has some really good frameworks in terms of how to do the transition that I think could be applied more broadly to social policy. I think there's an element of bringing some of the climate transition literature and practices, not that it's working particularly well in climate change.
It's not about the choice there, yeah.
But I think there are some really good frameworks and thinkers in that space that would be really useful in some of these issues that we're dealing with, because it really is the next 20 years where we're going to make many of these transitions, and how we manage with that pain, I think is going to be really useful.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry,
no,
go.
I was going to say, I think I completely agree with both of you on this. I mean, I think a lot of it's, the psychology, right? Is there's this entitled, we talk to a lot of clients, most of our clients are over 65, and who are saying, well, why am I getting this? Why am I getting NZ Super? I don't need this. Like, can I donate it back? I don't
They
want
can.
it.
Yeah,
I
they
know
can. There's a
or they
very
can
good
just never
charity.
apply. There are some great charities
Please
on that.
just
I
keep them
know
off.
we have pointed them in that direction,
Hey.
but like they don't need it or want it.
Of course.
So, you're getting to the point where I think means testing is absolutely inevitable. At what point, your point around transition, completely agree. It's a tricky one, right? Because there are also people who sit there and go, well, I've paid my taxes. I've been a good New Zealand citizen. I've lived here all my life. I've worked hard. I'm entitled to it, even if I don't need it.
And which is where Andrew Coleman's work is, that,
Yeah.
we have a, pay-go versus say-go thing.
Mm.
And a lot of people don't understand those differences. We hide behind these technical terms in many ways.
Mm.
But I think that conversation has shifted.
Yeah.
There are very few people, there's still one or two people who get into my mentions and go, oh, no, New Zealand Super is entirely affordable. Dude, you go do your own thing.
I think the same
also,
people that commented on mine.
Probably the same fella.
But I also think, there's an increasing realization that NZ Super is not going to give you a comfortable retirement.
Well, this is
either,
it, right?
So you should already be saving outside of that.
Yeah.
And
So, so we'll start in the front and then I'll go, yeah.
Hi, Michael Teeman. So you had to bring up this NZ Super, and actually this morning in the New Zealand Herald, we had some interesting commentary on this exact topic. But in terms of the questions that have been asked about what is the role of Treasury and what is the role of government and how do we become a learning institution, the commentary in this morning's Herald about the Super plan shows us that we have not learned certain lessons. The facts are back there. Only an optimist would say that hindsight is 20/20, because right now hindsight is 2200. Nobody is learning from the past, making a theory of change invalid. And I wonder whether Treasury could do a better job of articulating its economic learnings, which hopefully change over time. It's not as if economics, were true once and forever. Even quantum physics changes every 20 years. But if Treasury took a more robust role in educating the public on, what we have learned so that a theory could be operable, that would be fantastic.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Don't you think that's what they're trying to do with these reports this year? I think the quality of the reports this year was very much trying to get into that space exactly, is trying to be defensive and definitive to essentially going, here's what we've learned, here are some of the issues, here is how those interactions will come together in the future. I thought they did a much better job of it in this one compared to previous iterations. So I'd probably say we're heading in the right direction. So
Keep going.
I really enjoyed these. I'm a nerd. I love this stuff,
Yeah.
right? But I enjoyed this because I think it shifted the conversation, because the framing of it was different. And the framing of it was, we want good public services. We can't maintain them if we don't make some other choices along the way. And I think that got through, because that's how I'm reading the headlines and the commentary that's out there at the moment. It feels distinctly more mature than at any point in time in the last 10, 15 years.
I think I'd just say kudos to KiwiSaver as well, though. Like when you think back, what was it, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we didn't even have it, right? So it's actually been a step change for the New Zealand population in terms of psyche of thinking about how you save and how you invest. And from my perspective, actually, in terms of boosting financial literacy,
Yep.
I don't think, many people had actually been involved in the share market investment. There's, yes, 87 crash that burnt a lot of people, right? People never came back in, but actually KiwiSaver has built up that confidence to be like, okay, I can invest in the share market. I can invest in something outside of property, which we know isn't a productive asset. So I think that's been really beneficial from that regard, but it's a matter of what's the next iteration, what's the next step. And to be fair to the government, I think they've acknowledged basically the Aussie model is the way forward, right?
And I think, to your point, Zoe, I think with KiwiSaver, so when KiwiSaver started, about 20% of families used to save regularly, and now it's 60%. That is a huge shift. I mean, in a very short period of time, that is a big success in terms of shifting behavior. Is it enough? No, but is it heading in the right direction? The other thing KiwiSaver has done is it's a commitment device, right? Because it's a long-term thing. And I think that's the big difference with KiwiSaver. And, at Simplicity, that's kind of why we're leaning into some of these other things that we're trying to do, like the Infra Kiwi thing. We want to be one of the commitment devices to give you longevity. We want to be the buyer of assets that make money, so that once you kind of decide that you're going to build this thing, it doesn't become a political flip-flop
Mm.
because you've already signed a contract to sell it to 3.5 million Kiwis.
Mm.
Very, very hard to walk away from the deal, right?
Mm.
But also it becomes a little bit less problematic in terms of being a bad buyer, bad seller, because it's still the public in one way or the other who's doing the selling and the buying.
Mm.
Let me do a couple more questions, and then I've got one final. I'll give you the warning because somebody put a really good question here. Then this is how we'll finish up, because their question I'm going to ask you finally is: suppose you were writing an article entitled "How a Small Democracy Actually Fixed Its Long-Term Fiscal Problem." Based on these documents, what would the core plot twist have to be, and how would we have pulled it off? So just percolate on that one, because that's the question we're going to finish on.
Excellent question.
I just thought, whoa, Paul and Christy, and then I'll.
Economist in the room. So two parts. One on the retirement piece. Feels to me a lot of the discussion is what I would call in the OPEX space. You know, how does this generation pay for the services that generation's using? And I just wonder where the CapEx piece of that conversation might be. And so in the same way that getting the investment statement, you know, getting our balance sheet into the fiscal sustainability solution, where might capital solutions make or mitigate that transitional injustice?
Sorry. Do you think about what the Crown can do in terms of actually investing now?
Well, I guess it's possibly more broadly than that. You know, so there's a lot of talk internationally about the largest transfer of wealth as the boomers, you know, shuffle off. And so where does that capital that's been built up maybe play a part in that solution? So that was one thing. And the second, I guess, to Shamubeel's point about the longevity. Kiwi born, spent a lot of time in the UK. One of my observations coming back here after so long is the lack of institutions that have such long-term timeframes. And so I would ask the question is, what are those other institutions other than Treasury that can help stretch out that long-term timeframe and make that a more normal discussion?
Tackle the first one in terms of the capital investment piece. I think that's a fantastic question, because we know there's about 1.6, I think it might even be up to 1.8 trillion we estimated back of the envelope in New Zealand that's going to pass on in the next 20, 30 years. So huge sum of capital. A lot of that is invested in property, but an increasing amount of that is actually invested in financial assets like shares and bonds, etc. as well. So what does that get used for in terms of the next generation down? And I think one of the interesting questions that we see a lot of our clients asking is how do I best utilize that? You know, how do I make New Zealand better off with that? How do I make my kids better off with that? So a lot of the work that we do talks about, you know, actually intergenerational wealth transfer and how do you get that right? And the thing is, because people are living longer, you often get to the point where you're giving money to kids when they're in their 50s, already pretty well set up, 60s even, pretty well set up, have their own home, have paid down the debt, etc. And so what do they do with it? And so it's almost actually looking at the generation beyond that. And I think that's a really good way of thinking, both for individuals, but us as a country as well. Is actually how do you use that capital now to make that next generation beyond better off? So your grandchildren, essentially. I think, you know, we seriously have to look at, you know, how much we're investing in research and development in New Zealand, how much we're investing in property versus other assets in terms of actually growing business, our psyche around actually how we do business. The depth of our capital markets is fundamentally an issue that we haven't really cracked yet, is, you know, companies are still delisting to list on the ASX instead, or dual listing at very minimum. How do we get some of that money flowing? And I think a lot of that capital is going to come from New Zealand, but an increasing percentage of it is also going to come from offshore, and we have to figure out the right mechanisms for that as well. So I have probably more questions than answers, but I think those are the areas that we have to put some more thought into. Absolutely.
Let me duck in. Let me cut in. I'll get Christy to answer, because I am going to force you to answer the question. I just want to make sure we've got enough time for that.
Oh, well, mine's actually, my plot twist was intergenerational wealth transfer. So there's a perfect
would you like to do
link
yours
to
now?
that.
Yeah.
I mean, the challenge is, of course, the best way to deal with intergenerational wealth transfer is taxation and means testing, right? So those are the theoretical policy choices, right?
Juicy death tax.
Yeah, and that's really difficult for politically. But those are the mechanisms. And on your point around institutional arrangements, who has the long-term memory, who helps accountability. I mean, we see it in terms of the relative lack of depth of think tanks in the country. We also see it in the power of the parliamentary offices and, that kind of institutional machinery of government of what should be an office of parliament versus, so should the Retirement Commission, for example, be an office of parliament or that kind of thing. So there's some thinking that could be done there. I follow the UK Parliamentary Research Library. They do some cracker stuff if you're not following along with that. So my plot twist, to bring it back, was the plot twist is we actually have some amazing realization that we really are maybe not leaving the best economy, social infrastructure or planet for our grandchildren. And so best we do something about that. And there are a rich range of policy choices that do that, but that would be I don't know whether the plot would be a fever or a bolt from the sky, but that would need to come upon us, and it would need us to realise that some of the policy choices we have available actually just make sense, and we probably should get on with them sooner rather than later. And I think that's also the plot line of the Treasury's, stewardship reports as well.
Let me go to Christy, and then I'll come back to plot twists of the others. Christy.
Variation on Paul's question. So, how can we build social consensus for long-term decision making, given that, for example, the overlapping generations modelling quite starkly shows that we're not all benefiting from policies in the same way, so that some people benefit, some people lose. So, how can you really develop the institutions that support longer term thinking? And a little bit relatedly, should we be doing more sort of modelling of the political economy aspect of these choices to try and inform the debate a bit more?
Do you want me to start? Okay. You've got answers, haven't you?
No.
Okay. In terms of the modeling of it, I don't know, because you're the modeling expert, right? But if I think about in terms of understanding the fracturing of public sentiment on issues and thinking about mechanisms and how to kind of bridge some of that, absolutely. So more of those deliberative methods of reaching decisions, I think, are things we have to try. We have to experiment with new ways of doing things, because the way we're doing it is not bringing people along. We are hardening those divisions in society and its political preferences. I think that's probably where most of the opportunities lie. And they're not a panacea, right? But it's on specific issues like these big trade-offs where there are big costs that are borne by particular parts of society. I think we have no other choice but to experiment with other ways of doing democracy, including things like deliberative democracy. That's probably the only good idea I can think of off the hoof.
Yeah, I think the understanding of the impact piece is really interesting, right? I mean, that's kind of a key question. You think about kind of the generation retiring now, they've had this massive wealth effect from housing. We all know that. Unlikely to see that repeated in the next 20, 30 years in our view. So you've got these kind of generations who are suffering, they can't get in, they're locked out. You've now got rising unemployment, particularly in those lower, the sort of 19 to 25-year-olds as a result of artificial intelligence. I think that's becoming increasingly clear globally, at least, that is having an impact and is likely to have an impact here in New Zealand as well. So you've got these subsequent generations of voters who are getting really hard done by at the moment, getting disenfranchised essentially with what's going on in New Zealand political system and economy. So how do you look at actually making it right across generations? That's a big question in terms of the modelling, particularly if you're then talking about a bunch of things that are probably going to impact those generations more harshly than it has the older generation, right? Even if things like an inheritance tax, dare we say, again, hurt that next generation down, right? And admittedly, some of them are getting older, but
somebody's got to pay.
Somebody has to pay. And this how do you pitch that?
I think Shamubeel, that's his plot line. Somebody has to pay. Let me, so I'll start bringing things together here. And I just want to apologise to people who haven't asked questions either here, but there's some interesting questions I haven't got to on the screen that cover, what have we learned internationally? What empirical things, research should we do to drive things further forward? Some issues about, long-term bonds. But I think this one question is probably a really good way to bring it all back together. So I might actually start with you, Zoe. So just rehearsing the question, suppose you're writing an article, how a small democracy actually fixed its long-term fiscal problem. What's the core plot twist?
Bunch of fiscal nudges. How do you incentivize people to be altruistic, right? Or how do you make it so painless that people don't worry about it? Because at the moment it looks like there's big fiscal headwind coming. It's going to impact the younger generations. How do you make it easy? Is it like KiwiSaver, for example, you've got matching employer contributions, right? But if the government knows that at some point, what's the fiscal incentive? And we're just taking a bunch of those away from KiwiSaver. So there's actually very little incentive to save it within KiwiSaver other than your employer contribution. So how would you maybe flip that back again? Mm-hmm. The major plot twist is you somehow get generations to act altruistically, I think. Mm. Or you have a major crisis, which forces the issue. And I think that's probably the more likely scenario, is that it comes to such a point where you have that much pressure, a financial crisis, an economic crisis, where, you really reset the standard mechanisms, and you reset the way people think about this going forward. But unfortunately, you need a big catalyst, right? You can try for incremental change, but that doesn't necessarily shift the dial.
Thanks. Sarah?
Well, I did have my bolt from lightning that, this kind of visioning of intergenerational, a series of intergenerational mechanisms, recognitions of value, and you can use different policy techniques to shift that value around. I still remain confident in our system's ability to adapt. Is demography our destiny? I kind of say but actually you can shape it. And I feel like that's where I am with this set of choices we've got. And so, I think I already had my plot twist, which is really thinking about some of that wealth transferring stuff and making it a core feature of all of the analysis, bringing in the demographic implications as a major analytical set of observations, making that, building that into the Treasury recs, all of that kind of thing, and just consistently and systematically pushing forward on it.
Last word, Shamubeel.
There is a World War III. The boomers sign up to be the conscripts. And we have a major grand coalition across Labour and National that put in policies that last for 20 years.
Dystopian.
Somebody had to come up with that.
Yeah, thank you. One, I'd just like to thank you for attending today, particularly those of you online as well as yours here. I just really want to appreciate the panel. I think the nature of the questions you got tell you everything, but I thought that was a really incisive conversation. There's a lot of real value there. I think there's a lot for us to go away and think about. For me, I think this is really important. That the nub of that question, I think, is a question for us as well. And I think we will take that further forward. The other thing for us is when I started off, I talked about we can talk to ourselves a lot, but I think we're most influential when we talk to others. And so I just want to thank you for coming in and sharing your views. And the other side, I think there's an open invitation to you and to other people who are listening for Treasury to get out. And Shamubeel said to me something earlier, we always feel a bit reticent. Do we as a Treasury actually have anything to say? But actually, there is a thirst, I think, for some of these conversations. And I actually think we've got a good information base to work on that open up some of the possibilities. And so I think we're really open to doing that. So we're definitely looking for opportunities to do that over the next wee while as well. What am I supposed to say other than that? Just, yes, all the documents are available online. And once again, I personally really enjoyed this. So I thought it was great. I thought it was done in great spirit, great depth, great teamwork. And so I just want to thank our panel again, and if you wouldn't mind, offering them our applause. And I just think that was a great finale for a year, of fiscal policy for the future. Like I say, the band may have stopped, but the music will play on, and I think you can help us do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.